Cops handcuffed a black woman general for talking back. One call to the Pentagon ended their careers. On a quiet afternoon, a decorated black woman wearing her full military uniform entered a small-town cafe, intending only to grab a coffee and enjoy a peaceful break. She carried herself with the discipline and pride of someone who had given her entire life to service. Yet, to the local police officers watching her from outside, she was simply another face they believed they could control. When a minor disagreement sparked between her and the staff over a misunderstanding, the officers stepped in with arrogance. Instead of treating her with the respect her rank commanded, they accused her of being rude, claiming she was talking back. Within minutes, what should have been a simple conversation turned into a public humiliation. The officers shoved her against the hood of their squad car, cuffing her hands tightly behind her back while passers-by looked on in disbelief. Some filmed the shocking scene, unable to comprehend how a woman in full uniform, a general no less, was being treated as if she were a criminal. She remained calm, her training keeping her composed even in the face of blatant disrespect. When she tried to explain who she was, the officers only laughed, mocking her words and dismissing her identification as fake. They tightened the cuffs, dragging her toward the police car with complete disregard for the truth. But behind her, calm eyes, was a sharp awareness. She knew something they did not. Her authority extended far beyond this small-town station, and she had the power to bring down their arrogance with just one move. As she sat in the back seat of the police cruiser, she made a single phone call. Her voice was steady, her words direct, and within moments the wheels of justice began to turn. At the station, the officers carried themselves with smug confidence, unaware of the storm racing toward them. Phones began to ring, not once, but over and over. Commanding voices demanded explanations, identifying themselves as top officials from the Pentagon. Confusion turned into panic as the officers realized the woman they mocked was exactly who she claimed to be, a decorated general. Within minutes, military police vehicles pulled up outside, their presence impossible to ignore. The same woman, who was dragged into the station in handcuffs, was escorted out with honor, while the officers who had disrespected her were left standing pale and speechless. That evening, the truth spread like wildfire. The incident made headlines, sparking outrage across the country. The Pentagon moved swiftly, suspending the officers and opening a full investigation into their abuse of power. Their careers were effectively over, ended by their arrogance and ignorance. Meanwhile, the general stood tall, unshaken, a symbol of dignity and strength. In a calm statement, she reminded everyone that true power does not come from shouting or violence. It comes from discipline, integrity, and the authority of service. For the officers, one careless decision had destroyed everything they had worked for. For her, one phone call had been enough to end their careers forever. It was supposed to be just another quiet afternoon when the decorated black woman, dressed in her crisp military uniform, stepped into a small-town cafe. She carried herself with the discipline and calm presence of someone who had spent years serving her country at the highest level, but to the police officers loitering outside, none of that mattered. A minor misunderstanding with the staff turned into something far bigger when the officers decided to intervene, not with respect or professionalism, but with arrogance and bias. They accused her of being disrespectful, claiming she was talking back, when in reality she had only spoken with the confidence and clarity of her position. Without hesitation, they grabbed her, pushed her against the cold metal hood of their squad car, and forced handcuffs around her wrists in front of stunned onlookers. People whispered, some took out their phones to record, and others shook their heads, unable to believe that a woman in uniform, a general no less, was being treated like a common criminal. Even as the metal bit into her skin, she remained composed. Years of military training had taught her not to break under pressure, not to give her enemies the satisfaction of seeing her falter. She calmly told them who she was, stated her rank, and presented her identification. But the officers only laughed. They mocked her words, called her a liar, and dismissed the possibility that someone of her stature could be standing before them. To them, her authority was an act, a story they didn't care to verify. One of them even smirked as he tightened the cuffs further, dragging her toward the back seat of the police cruiser as if she were nothing more than a nuisance. But as she was shoved inside, she knew something they didn't. These men thought they had stripped her of her power, but the truth was that her voice carried more weight than their entire precinct combined. Sitting in the back of the car, she steadied her breathing and pulled out her phone. With a single call, her calm voice traveled farther than the small-town station, reaching the very heart of the Pentagon. She didn't need to shout or beg. Her words were clear, precise, and backed by decades of service and unquestionable authority. Within minutes, the officers who mocked her began to feel the ripple effect of that one decision. Phones at the station rang off the hook. Senior officials demanded answers. Panic spread among the ranks as they realized the woman they had cuffed was exactly who she claimed to be. Military vehicles rolled in, and the very ground beneath their arrogance shook. The woman they thought they had humiliated walked out of the station with dignity, escorted and honored by her own, while the officers who had laughed at her stood frozen, their careers already crumbling. They had gambled on ignorance and disrespect, but one phone call had turned the tables. They had tried to strip her of her authority, yet she reminded them, and the world, that true power cannot be handcuffed. Within minutes of her calm but deliberate phone call, the small-town police station began to feel the weight of a storm they had never experienced before. At first, it was just a single phone ringing on the front desk, but soon it became a chorus of calls echoing through every corner of the building. Secretaries looked pale as they answered, realizing the voices on the other end weren't ordinary citizens. They were high-ranking officials from the Pentagon, demanding to know why one of their most respected generals was sitting in a jail cell. The officers who had mocked her only an hour ago suddenly felt their arrogance slipping away, replaced by a creeping panic they could no longer hide. Every unanswered question, every order barked at them through the phone lines reminded them that they were no longer in control of this situation. The small-town authority they clung to meant nothing when measured against the weight of the United States military. Outside, the sound of engines grew louder as black vehicles with tinted windows and flashing lights surrounded the station. These were not local police cars or county sheriffs. These were military police convoys, armored and precise, each movement sharp with discipline. The townspeople who had gathered earlier now stood frozen, whispering among themselves as they watched a scene unfold that no one had ever imagined. Men and women in uniform stepped out of the vehicles with a commanding presence, their boots striking the pavement like thunder, their eyes locked on the building that had dared to disrespect one of their own. Inside, the officers who once carried themselves with smug confidence now stood in silence, their throats dry, their faces pale, realizing too late the magnitude of their mistake. The door to the holding area opened, and the same woman they had, dragged in with cuffs cutting into her wrists, walked out with her head held high. But this time, she wasn't alone. Flanked by military police, she was treated with the honor and respect her service demanded. The very handcuffs that had been a tool of humiliation were removed with urgency, and the sight of her being saluted by soldiers sent a shockwave through the station. The officers who had laughed at her authority just hours before now stood frozen, unable to meet her gaze. The town had never witnessed such a dramatic reversal of power. In that moment, it became clear that their careers were not simply in jeopardy, they were already finished. The station, once filled with arrogance, had been silenced by the presence of true authority. The general said nothing to her captors. She didn't need to. The ringing phones, the flashing lights outside, and the soldiers standing guard spoke louder than words ever could. She was escorted out into the daylight with the respect of her rank, leaving behind officers whose futures had collapsed in a single afternoon. The message was unmistakable. Power abused will always be checked, and no one, not even a local cop, could ever diminish the authority of a leader who carried the trust of a nation. Later that evening, the weight of the incident stretched far beyond the walls of the small-town station and became the subject of national attention. Reporters gathered in rows, their cameras flashing, eager to capture the unfolding story that was quickly dominating headlines. At the center of the press conference stood the general, calm and composed, wearing the same uniform in which she had been humiliated only hours earlier. This time, however, she stood tall, her posture firm, her eyes unwavering. She did not need to raise her voice or deliver fiery words. The silence that followed her presence spoke volumes. When she finally spoke, her tone was steady, each word measured, carrying the authority of someone who had commanded troops, protected her country, and earned the respect of a nation. She did not dwell on the insult or the pain she had endured. Instead, she focused on the larger truth, that disrespect toward a decorated officer was not just personal, it was an attack on the honor of the entire military chain of command. The Pentagon officials standing beside her reinforced that truth. With actions, not just words, documents were read aloud confirming that the officers involved in her unlawful arrest had been placed on immediate suspension. An independent investigation had been launched, and the charges of misconduct and abuse of power would be pursued with the full weight of the law. Their names, once hidden behind badges, were now revealed to the public, and their faces were burned into the evening broadcasts. Their arrogance, which only hours ago seemed untouchable, had been dismantled in front of the world. Careers that had taken years to build were now shattered in a single day, destroyed not by violence, but by their own ignorance and abuse of authority. As the cameras rolled, the general made one final statement that resonated beyond the room. She reminded everyone watching that true power does not come from yelling, intimidation, or the misuse of authority. True power, she said, comes from discipline, honor, and the respect earned through service. With those words, she turned away. From the podium, her silence as impactful as her speech. Behind her, the military escorts followed, leaving the press buzzing with questions but knowing they had just witnessed something historic. For the officers who had once laughed at her, the reality could not have been harsher. Their reputations were ruined, their futures in law enforcement destroyed, and their disgrace cemented in the public eye. They had believed they were dealing with someone powerless, but they had instead collided with the highest levels of authority. One careless decision, one moment of arrogance had cost them everything. For the general, however, the ordeal became a reminder that dignity and calm resolve can topple even the strongest walls of injustice. For the world watching, it was a lesson that respect must never be selective, and that underestimating someone, based on prejudice, can lead to consequences more permanent than any set of handcuffs.